Hi, this is Jessie Stoner, and I'm here today with Bob Johansen, author of the new book, The Leadership Literacies, Thriving in a Future of Extreme Disruption and Distributed Everything. And it's a great opportunity. I love the book. I was fascinated by it, underlining in it in many places. And we have an opportunity to talk with Bob today about some of the ideas in there that I found particularly interesting and intriguing. So, hi, Bob. Glad to have you here today.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Thank you. So you're a futurist, and that's always exciting to find out what the future is going to be. I loved your explanation of what the difference is between a futurist and a fortune teller in the book. A futurist, it really made sense to me, and I'm not sure I actually ever thought about it this way, but you said that to evaluate a futurist, you ask if the foresight provided insight that led to a better decision in the present. You evaluate a fortune teller to ask whether or not the foresight actually happened. That
Right.
futurists should not and cannot predict the future, they should provoke insight.
Right. That's the basic idea. And so often, I think I resisted the name futurist for many years, and I've finally given in and said, yeah, I guess that's what I am. So futurists often are thought of as people who predict the future. But we actually don't use the word predict here at the Institute for the Future, and we correct people who do, because what we say is nobody can predict the future. And if somebody tells you they can predict the future, you shouldn't believe them, especially if they're from California.
All right. Well, that's as you are.
Yeah, as I am. But you can do a lot better than nothing. And we define a foresight or a forecast as a plausible, internally consistent, provocative story from the future that's designed to provoke insight and action. And indeed, some of the forecasted futures that are in the book, I hope, do not happen. And the evaluation for success is, do we have enough insight to prevent the future from happening?
Yeah, it's like, like you're looking at possible futures and then help us make better decisions today, either to move towards them or away from them.
Exactly. And it's, I went to divinity school, and, when you think about the future from a theological point of view, there's prophetic futures where, a prophet, like a biblical prophet, is actually predicting the future and making the future, and has a belief, an intense faith-filled belief that he or she can make the future. That's not the kind of futurist I am. I'm studying alternative futures. I'm not prophetic.
Well, and yet you are looking at certain things, and I thought it was interesting that you make a distinction between trends and disruptions. And
Yes.
And I think the term disruption is very common these days, although I think it's turning into a bit of a fad. Like anything that changes things is considered a disruption, as opposed to
Right.
the true intent of the meaning of the word disruption, which actually changes patterns, not just.
Yeah. This was an issue when I wrote the book, and some of the folks at our publisher, Barrett Kohler, said, "Oh no, disruption is passé. You shouldn't do that." And I haven't given up on the word. I think it has been watered down and devalued and popularized. But for me, the definition is very clear. A trend is a pattern of change you can extrapolate from with confidence, and a disruption is a break in the pattern of change, a break, something you don't expect. And we shouldn't give up on the word. I mean, it's too important of a word to kind of just say, okay, we're going to change our language. Instead, we got to learn how to deal with them.
It's a problem. I mean, for me also with the term vision, the work that I do in the field, I've stopped actually using the word a whole lot, but the concept is too important, but because it's so misunderstood. If we don't use a word and actually define it in a way that makes sense, then it's hard to have any kind of a language around it.
That's right. I've actually gotten quite negative about acronyms lately because I'm afraid acronyms tend to do the same thing, and they're a shorthand for people who use the word a lot, but it often I think you are often better off if we say things out. Human resources is a good example of that. Human resources has been turned into HR, and it's been outsourced and trivialized, and it's just taken on a whole different meaning, where the term human resources is very powerful and very important. So I advise human resource people now to don't call yourself HR, say we're human resources with a pause, and give people a chance to engage with the term. So I think in our shorthand, we often tend to reduce things to stereotypes or acronyms instead of just being more careful in our choice of words.
So tiptoeing around, not wanting to use the word trend, but there are things, maybe forces might be the word that you're looking at, they're impacting us, that do cause disruption, and you're saying disruption is something that's going to continue, and that there's also a movement towards a continuation in the extreme of distribution of power, information, anything, almost anything that you could think about. And I'm wondering, and I also do want to get to the implications for leaders and organizations, but could you just say a little bit about why you're seeing this continuation of disruption and distribution, where it's coming from and how it's moving us?
Yeah, so we got to share a little history here, because these things take a long time to unfold. And the thing about writing this book that surprised me is it turned out it was more autobiographical than I thought, because the arc of my career has pretty much followed the arc of the internet. And the internet is at the core of why we can now say with a lot of certainty that anything that can be distributed will be distributed. And it goes back to the core concept of the internet, which has come to be called packet switching, but was actually originally called hot potato routing. Powerful, powerful metaphor in term. And it was invented by Paul Barron, one of our founders here. And it was essential to trying to create a network that would resist nuclear attack, because in those days, networks were centralized. And if an enemy took out any portion of the network, there was a risk that the whole network would go down. So Paul and others invented this technology to break messages down into packets and then reassemble at the other end. Now, the implication is, however, that you create networks that have no center, that grow from the edges, and can't be controlled. And what's happened is, since that invention in 1964, the early papers, the ARPANET, as it was called, the predecessor to the internet, began in 1968. It was publicly introduced in 72. That was my first professional paper. And then it scaled to where we are now. But where we are now is not at all where we're going. Today's internet is not sustainable. It's not secure enough. It's not private enough. It's not commercially viable enough. So you can think of today's internet as the world's largest market test for what's going to happen next. And what's going to happen next is hot potato routing is going to mean anything that can be distributed will be distributed. And that will lead to these new kinds of organizations. We used to call them, network organizations, or I called them Fishnet organizations in the 90s. But the term I like now is shape-shifting organization. And when shape-shifting competes with hierarchies, shape-shifting will almost always win. And the really scary thing is the criminals are much better at shape-shifting than we are.
Right. So that's really helpful. And, there's a lot there as you're, I love the metaphor of the fishnet when you talk about the routing, because that's actually a visual of what it actually looks like, that every single point is connected to every other single point, as opposed to some sort of a central point that things are connected to.
Yes, exactly. And, I have a graphic in the book and an animation that I use in my talks. And I showed this landscape of shape-shifting organizations to a CEO of a very large organization just a couple of weeks ago. And he looked at me and he kind of stuck his chin out when he said this. He said, "Where do I sit?" And
Uh-huh.
I said, I'm not sure you sit at all. I think you're going to be running, or maybe on the good days, you're going to be dancing, but you're not going to be at the top. You're going to be at the bottom.
Right.
You're going to be at the foundation. That's where the leaders will be.
Well, and the thing that actually just has me chuckling most of the time is when people think they actually have a choice. You know, that, oh, well, then I'm not going to sit anywhere, then I'm not buying into it. It's fine, you know, join the Luddites, you know, fight you'll have the same success that they had with the Industrial Revolution. It's going to happen whether you like it or not. So you might well understand what it is and where and how you can fit so that you can actually have an impact in the way that you want. So we're talking right now about what you're calling shape-shifting organizations, and you know, using a mental image of a fishnet. You had originally called them fishnet organizations. I liked your diagram that, you know, any point on a fishnet that you pick up, it can become a central point, and that. And I also loved your explanation that structures can arise to support what needs to happen within that, as well as leadership arises within it. And then when that particular purpose no longer is necessary, it goes flat again, and another point in the organization rises up, another point.
That's right.
So it fits with the ideas that I've been exploring around emergent leadership.
It definitely does. It's a very good fit with your work as well. And another principle then comes out of this that I think is, again, a sure thing forecast. This future rewards clarity, but it punishes certainty. So clarity, fortunately, we've got some very good military experience with shape-shifting organizations that, as I've learned about it, I teach now at the Army War College, and I'm not a military guy, but I've learned so much from them, and I talk about it a lot in the book. But what they've got a language for it, they call it commander's intent, and it means very, very clear where you're going. This is the vision, very clear where you're going, but very flexible how you get there. And that wins in that kind of world. So they also call it mission command, which is broader. And the new word that didn't even make it to the book because it was published after I sent in my manuscript is flexive command, F-L-E-X-I-V-E, flexive command. And the idea of that is mission command, but you continuously reevaluate with your situation awareness. You reevaluate who's in the best position to make which decision at what time. And that keeps getting reevaluated. Now, that kind of flexive command is much more powerful for engaging with a highly uncertain future than a hierarchy, because hierarchies work fine if you're in a slow-moving, stable, predictable environment. It's just there aren't that many of those anymore. So you have to kind of be hierarchical when the times call for that. That can be a fallback position, but the times aren't going to call for that nearly as much as they used to.
So I'm curious, like you've alluded to this a couple of times, that the people that are actually doing this right now or doing it well are criminals and terrorist organizations. And now you also mentioned the military. And I think we can kind of imagine examples of that. Are there other organizations that are actually moving into this now, or I'm thinking of organizations that are transforming or are actually there?
There's a lot of examples on a relatively small scale. Almost any organization has some shape-shifting subset, but it could be an innovation group or some kind of edgy practice. At a wider level, think of things like the Hollywood model, where you're making a movie, you pull together people who are used to working together to make a movie, and when the movie's done, all bets are off. And the loyalty is to the director or the producer or to the sound people you were working with or the script writers or the costumes people, whoever your social network is. The loyalty is to your diaspora, if you will. And that is shape-shifting. Now, health and healthcare is closer. If you look at the way emergency rooms run, that's straight shapeshifting. The way emergency room, when I was writing the book, I talked to a number of my friends who work in and lead in emergency rooms, and they said, "Oh yeah, that's what we do. You know, that's basically what they do."
Yeah.
And consultancies run like this to some extent. There's a lot of use of simulation. Again, in healthcare, some of the best medical schools now run mostly on games and robots to lower the risk of practicing on humans. And then gradually, the medical student starts working with real human bodies.
What about some of the, the newer organizations that are internet based?
Yeah.
Or even
Yeah.
like Facebook. I'm thinking, even though that's not new, that's what we're all familiar with, or Amazon.
Yeah, definitely.
In what ways do you see them as shape-shifting or not?
Well, I've got a number of examples in the book about kind of extreme shape-shifting that are free-form organizations. Facebook's become pretty institutionalized now, so there are shape-shifting elements in it, but it's not as much as it used to be. It's very hard to scale this. I think that's really the challenge. And again, I went to divinity school, and I kind of think back, how did the Jesuits do it? When you think about the Jesuits before media, so you had Jesuit priests all around the world doing very similar things for good or evil, but they were very well coordinated, and they have no media. So how did they do that? They did it through belief, and they did it through discipline, and they did it through faith. Very tricky. But now in organizational form, you've got to similarly have a vision, purpose, values, discipline, practices, worldviews. Those are the kind of things that hold you together as you scale. And in today's world, there's more of a tendency to rely on the media, the more explicit communication media, and in many cases not really use them very well. I mean, look at how many, I get to work with some of the world's best companies, and conference calls. You would think we'd know how to run conference calls by now, that at least we'd have good sound quality, and at least people would have the good sense to show up on time. But we have so many conference calls that are just very poorly run, and you can't hear people, and people come and go. And it's crazy how undisciplined we are in many cases for the use of our media. So I think what you need to scale this is good communications media, but probably even much more important is good discipline.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like, and you talk about how those who became adults in 2010 are better prepared for this world. I look at my children, and they're in their 20s, and they're certainly better prepared. And my son, who works for, he's what they call a coder, a computer programmer.
Yeah.
He works for a company where 70% of the employees work virtually, and it works very well for them because they don't have all these bad habits that those who've been around for a long time have. So it is interesting. And I'm also curious because you talk about memes and the role of memes. And I think that's a huge part of what you're talking about. And I'm wondering if you could say more about what they are and how they're used to provide leadership.
Yeah, so memes, again, go back to the Jesuits. The Jesuits were loaded with good memes. They were really good at spreading those spiritual memes. Again, for better or worse, I'm not generally praising the Jesuit content here. I'm more praising how they connect, or how they did connect anyway. But I do think memes are viral spreading of methods, of content, of ideas, of concepts. And that discipline and that way of spreading happens within these shape-shifting organizations. And I really like the term diaspora. It originally meant the Jewish people separated from the promised land. The modern definition that I like to use is values-linked social networks. So you've got values linked, and I've worked with Procter & Gamble a lot over the years, and When A.G. Lafley became the CEO, I had been working for the company for quite a while, and it was a promote from within company. And it became clear that it couldn't continue being that. When A.G. Lafley became the CEO, he said, we can no longer promise lifelong employment, but we can promise lifelong employability.
Ah, excellent.
And with the values of P&G, I mean, it's a very high valued company. It's them and McKinsey probably hire better than any company I've ever worked with. So they hire wonderfully smart people, but for the most part, really high valued people too, really just good people that are also smart. And that creates a diaspora. So now, when I started working with P&G, if somebody left the company, it was like they died. You weren't supposed to talk about them anymore. And now, when you join the company, you're part of the diaspora. And even though I've never formally been an employee, I'm part of the diaspora. So the new book I did the keynote for the P&G Alumni Association when the new book came out. And P&G is, in many ways, if you think of the P&G diaspora as a shape-shifting organization, it is, where a lot of the traditional P&G company is still a traditional hierarchy.
So, and what you make me think about is control, just the idea of control. Because when you talk about the viral spreading of ideas, and you talk about a diaspora of values-linked social networks, there's not a lot of control over these kinds of things. And I think you talk a little bit about distributed authority. And so I'm just wondering if you could say more about what that means and how that plays out in terms of leadership and the kind of shifts we need to make.
So if you think of these shape-shifting organizations, they can't be controlled. They really can't be controlled. They can be guided. And that's where clarity of direction comes in. You can give clarity of direction, but then you need discipline and flexibility of execution. So the challenge is, how do you do that in this world where the next step beyond today's internet is going to be something like distributed computing? Say blockchain is a good example of that, beginning with Bitcoin in 2008, where you have distributed authority computing, and you have that ability to create these networks that have no center, can't be controlled, hierarchies come and go, grow from the edges. That kind of amplified connectivity. And the interesting thing about Bitcoin, for example, which is blockchain, an example of blockchain, which is an example of distributed computing. The interesting thing about Bitcoin is it's a bank, a cryptocurrency as it's called. It's a bank without a bank. There's no central authority.
Right.
So what it's providing is essentially a high trust medium within a low trust environment. It started in 2008 where nobody trusted the banks. The place where Bitcoin is used most commonly now are places like Argentina or Venezuela, where the national currency isn't trusted. So it all comes back to trust. And we're moving in this next decade now to an era where it's actually possible to have distributed authority. So the real risk becomes, and again, I'm focused my life 10 years ahead. I'm not an expert in the present. I don't talk about politics. But if you look at the current mood in the United States, I'm going to Washington on Monday, the current mood in the United States, some people are worried about authoritarianism or kind of some takeover. I'm not at all, because in this kind of world, the risk is not authoritarianism or totalitarianism because of this inevitable, anything that can be distributed will be distributed. The risk is that we lose our ability to govern, that it gets so distributed and so lacking in central authority that we can't really get anything done. That's the risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, the short-term reactivity is part of a transition phase that we're going through. Even looking at, the DAO, which was a great experiment that did not succeed. And there
Do your
are,
listeners know what that is?
well, say a little more, please.
That's impressive if they do.
Okay. Okay.
So there's two meanings of that term. It's the DAO.
I was talking about the organization, right?
Okay, so so DAO as a category is distributed autonomous organization. So basically, a bank without a bank. But the DAO was an effort to create a algorithmic run investment structure, and it wasn't exactly hacked. It was just the rules weren't fully operational. So someone took advantage of the rules. They didn't, I wouldn't say that it was a criminal act. It was just a clever misuse of the rules in such a way that this individual ended up making a lot of money and took advantage of the system in a way that was not intended. So that distributed autonomous organization was, in many people's eyes, a failure. And I think in a way it was, but it was also an early experiment, we'd call it a signal, of the reality that we are going to see 10 years from now. We're going to have more examples of companies that are actually run by algorithms, not by people.
Right. And that's what I was thinking is, like when you talk about looking at the future and you say that it's easier to look 10 years out than 1 year. And I think it's taking that broad view and looking at where things are going in the long term is what you're doing right now when you're talking about authoritarianism versus lack of any kind of guidance. And
that's right.
So that's the challenge.
That's right. And this is the point in the conversation when all of us should have a headache. I mean, if you don't have a headache right now, you're not paying attention, because this whole idea of distributed authority is mind-boggling. It's just a very different way of thinking and acting than we've ever had. I've been studying blockchain for 3 years, and I still glaze over whenever I get into the conversation. It's a really mind-boggling concept.
Right, and yet it's going to be it's as mind-boggling for us as the idea of mass transportation was 2 years ago.
Maybe, but it's kind of the opposite in a way, because and that was mind-boggling because it was centralizing or at least making an internal central infrastructure. This is mind-boggling because it's giving a distributed infrastructure.
Yes, and so it's not, and you make this point early on in your book, it's not a shift from centralized to decentralized, which is the shift we tend to do back and forth. This is a shift out of that paradigm and into distributed, which is a very different way of thinking. And
it's a disruption, yes.
Yeah, it is. It certainly is. Well, I just want to, there's so much in your book, and we certainly could talk to you for so much longer. We didn't even talk about gaming and learning and all those fun
Yeah, next time.
Well, I think, what I will do is say to those who are listening to the podcast, get a copy of this book. It's really fascinating. And then if you get a headache, take a breath and go back and read it some more, because it's a fun headache. You talk about taking risk for the fun of it. I'd say get a headache for the fun of it while you're at it.
Right. I hope it's a constructive headache.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's mind expanding is what it is.
Yes, right. That's good. Yeah.
Okay, well, Bob, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's really great to meet you, Jesse.